Welcome to the Present History podcast. This is the second part of our conversation about Katherine Howard, so make sure to go back and check out the first one if you haven't already. There's also a quick little trigger warning for this episode. We do touch on topics including sexual assault and abuse, rape, and inappropriate sexual relationships. But we hope that you enjoy this episode of the Present History podcast. In terms of those media portrayals, the way that she has been portrayed in modern media, and you spoke about the Tudors TV show.
Yeah.
At the beginning. And what's interesting, I read your blog post about it actually, and what you mentioned was that Katherine Howard is the one that appears naked on screen more than any of the other wives.
With only being in 6 episodes.
Which is even more impressive.
More than any character, not just the wives.
Wow, okay, yeah.
So, I mean, Henry has his fair share of sex scenes in that show, but Katherine is still appearing fully naked more than any of the others, and is very sexualized in that show. I mean, that was a later portrayal. She's been portrayed earlier than that. I mean, one of the first portrayals is the Private Life of Henry VIII, but that changes her life very much so. Like, she's definitely portrayed not necessarily factually accurate in that one, but sort of the first more factual portrayal of her was in 1970, and that was the miniseries that most people have probably at least heard of, The Six Wives of Henry VIII, with Keith Mitchell as Henry VIII. And in this one, she is portrayed really, or depicted really, as petty and very mean, and also highly sexualized. But in this one, her affair with Culpeper is started because she's desperate to conceive a child. And Henry cannot. I mean, it is debated amongst historians he may have been impotent by this point. And there was an expectation that she have a child. So in that way, there's some sympathy for Katherine in the show, but in the end, she's sort of a nasty character. And, she's on it for a very short amount of time, as she mostly is in most portrayals. There's not a lot of time to really give her much screen time. But that was sort of the first defining portrayal of Katherine. And the next came also with Keith Mitchell. In 1972, they did sort of a movie version of the miniseries. And that one was called Henry VIII and His Six Wives. And in this one, it's actually one of the most sympathetic portrayals of Katherine. She's portrayed by an actress called Lynn Fredericks, which she was also in the movie Nicholas and Alexandra about the Romanovs. So she was in quite a few historical movies around this time. But in this one, she is portrayed as very young, very naive, and pretty much manipulated into her position by her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk. And so it's interesting because she's not very sexualized at this point. The affair is what she is executed for, but it's not portrayed in the movie. It's all off screen. Her early life isn't portrayed in the movie. And I mean, some people argue that the movie is written from Henry's perspective because he is on his deathbed during the film. And so he wouldn't have known Katherine at those points. So the parts that are shown of her are what Henry VIII knew. But it is an interesting portrayal, although because it's a movie, she is also in it for a very short amount of time. So she's barely fleshed out as a character. But it's sort of the first time you see like a potential for a really sympathetic view of her. But then in came the Tudors. After that, there have been a few in between that, but the Tudors are probably the most famous. I know, at least in America, where we don't learn about them in school, that is probably one of the first contacts people have had with the Tudors, is this TV show. It was widely watched at the time, and she's very, very sexualized in this show. but also sort of oddly portrayed as dumb and not educated, which would not have been the case. She was an aristocrat. She would have been educated. I mean, women weren't always intensely educated by this point, but, you know, she's sort of childlike to an annoying point in this show.
Right.
You know, there is the Lynn Fredericks naivety and childlike persona that's, you know, it does make you very sympathetic. Katherine in The Tudors, her childlike is just, yeah, more annoying because it's like, you should know better than this right now. Like, you're older, don't act like a little spoiled 9-year-old, like, not getting what you want. And I think one of the worst parts is that her relationship with Thomas Culpepper is really started out of boredom or also like sexual dissatisfaction with Henry.
Right.
That he gets ill, he's not able to have sex with her, and she starts this relationship with Thomas Culpepper. So it also makes it very unsympathetic when it all falls apart. I mean, in the beginning, she's a little more tentative about starting the relationship, but by the end, pretty much all the characters around her are like, you need to stop this relationship, like, you're gonna get us all in trouble. And she's the one who, you know, says, which apparently is from records of the time, but she says to Lady Rochford in one of the episodes, you know, I know how to meddle with a man without becoming pregnant. You know, like, she is this character that's like, oh, no, I just want to have a good time. She is that good time girl that David Starkey talks about in this show. And, I mean, you do feel sympathy for her by the end. She has this really beautiful, like, ballet montage, which is sort of odd in The Tudors.
Interesting. Yeah.
But, yeah, sort of like Rodgers and Hammerstein ballet. But it's sort of put in between the executions of Culpepper and Derham, which are very gory and very gross in the show. But she's all in white and she's dancing this beautiful ballet as her lovers are being executed.
Wow.
So that's sort of the shift all of a sudden in the show when it's like, no, now we're supposed to sympathize. Now we're supposed to feel really bad for her. And she does have the scene with the block, although she's naked in that scene.
Well, of course. You have to be.
That was a weird, an add-in where it was like, this isn't supposed to be a sexual moment.
Yeah, exactly.
But,
interesting choice.
Which is just like full circle epitome of how she's portrayed in that show.
Yeah.
Even to the end, when we're supposed to be sympathizing and we're supposed to see how terrified she is, she's naked. And it sort of takes you out of that of like, once again, we're sexualizing her in this moment. You can't just sit there and feel bad for this girl. Like, you have to be in the moment of, oh yeah, sexy.
Yeah.
And yeah, then she sort of, she is executed in the show, and she says the famous line that some people say that she said it on the scaffold, that I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpepper. Historians do not believe she actually said that.
Yeah.
But the show does portray her saying it. It sort of feels like the attempt to once again drive home of like this Romeo and Juliet story.
Yeah.
At the last minute, because in the midst of it, it isn't really portrayed that way. Culpepper is one nasty character in that show. And so it is interesting that it sort of makes that her legacy, but it had been her legacy long before the Tudors came along. But that sort of put it into the modern perception of who she is Tamsin Merchant. Beautiful as an actress, but the over-sexualized version of Katherine Howard. And yeah, it is sort of unfortunate because she has the potential to be really complex and interesting and portray that side of her, but also give her a little more credit for being a little more intelligent and interesting as a human being, not just the good time girl that you think you would meet in a high school drama. Yeah. Like, it does feel at times straight out of Mean Girls. Right. The Tudors scenes with Katherine Howard, especially her scenes with Mary. Right. Those are like Tudor Mean Girls right there. Like, it's pretty intense. And I mean, hilarious to watch once you've seen it enough times and you're like, oh my God, here we go.
Yeah.
Here's the Mean Girls moment. But it's interesting.
It is. Interesting. It's fascinating. And in terms of her relationship with Thomas Culpeper, it's interesting that the portrayal of that as well.
Yeah.
It's usually portrayed, like you said, as this Romeo and Juliet or Helen and Paris kind of relationship, where in fact he was the one that left her for someone else early on in their relationship.
Yes.
She was the one that kind of initiated it back up. And one of my favorite things about reading about their relationship is some of the ways that they teased each other in their letters, because he would say stuff like, oh, we could have had this before if you hadn't married the king. And she would say, oh yeah, I'm giving you this gift of bracelets to remember me whenever you embrace another woman or something like that. And it's hilarious kind of dynamic, but it's interesting, this portrayal, that it is this kind of dramatic tragedy kind of way of looking at it, whereas it might not have been truly that. Yeah.
I do agree that it's usually portrayed very black and white in fiction, that it is often either the Romeo and Juliet that, they inconveniently meet each other after her marriage to the king.
Yeah.
Which was not the case. They had known each other. There had been talks of marriage while she was at court. But yeah, he slept with someone else and ruined it. God. But but there's either that or sort of what the Tudors does, or they try to go back and forth between the two. But, he in the Tudors is portrayed as a manipulative rapist, pretty much.
Wow.
There is a rape scene in the show that is based on contemporary reports that he had raped a park keeper's wife and the king interceded to pardon him. But in the Tudors, that is portrayed very much of like, that's his personality, and he sees the queen and he is sexually attracted to her and he wants her, and that's sort of it. And he says in the show at one point, when someone is saying like, oh, that's the queen, like you can't think these things about her, he says, well, don't tell me that you haven't imagined her without her clothes on. And it's like this very sort of, like a sexual predator is how he's sort of portrayed. That Catherine is portrayed as falling in love with him in the show. He never really is. It's always about the sex and what he can get out of her. And even by the end, he sort of like throws her under the bus in the show and says, she manipulated me into this relationship. I didn't want it, blah, 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 as sort of an attempt to save himself, which obviously doesn't work. But it is sort of a weird, like, mix of the two that you usually get one or the other, not down the middle, which is probably a little closer to what it was. I have no doubt that there was an attraction between them and, that there was feelings. Whether that went all the way into a Romeo and Juliet, or even if they consummated their relationship, we don't know, and we never will. But I think it's a little, once again, in most things in Catherine's story, a little more complex than sort of the popular perception of their relationship and how it was conducted.
Yeah, and it's that complexity that's so fascinating to me as well, because like with the report of him supposedly raping the park keeper's wife, his brother was also called Thomas Culpeper.
Yes, and that has been some claims that it actually wasn't the Thomas Culpeper. It was a different Thomas Culpeper, which is such a classic Tudor problem, that they all have the same names. They're all from the same families.
Exactly.
So there were probably like 5 Thomas Culpepers running around somewhere at the time.
And Catherine's mother was a Culpeper as well, so she was distantly related to Thomas. And it's just, the whole thing is somehow you can find a connection at some point.
It's very incestuous back then. Yes. Like they're all somehow related. And especially because the families tended to be so large.
Yeah.
The likelihood of you being cousins with this guy that you're about to marry, probably very high.
Yeah.
And wasn't a problem back then either. You didn't have to get a dispensation for that. Closer, yes, but that was sort of seen as not that closely related. But yeah,
it's very interesting. And in terms of the way that she was killed and the final verdict, what she was accused of, Like you mentioned before, she was accused of intention
Yeah.
to commit adultery. It wasn't adultery itself that got her killed, because adultery, the queen having an affair, wasn't actually treason
No.
at the time of the Tudor period, but raping a queen, that was treason.
Yes.
And then when Henry kind of expanded the laws out to make sure he could get rid of his wives whenever he wanted,
Exactly.
he included the intention to commit adultery
Yeah.
as a criminal treasonous offense.
And usually it was tied into, imagining the death of a king.
Right, yeah.
Whether that's through, that was tied into Anne Boleyn's, but for a queen to have an affair, it was more that they were going to destroy the lineage of the king.
Yeah.
Because there was a potential that you would have a child with the man that you were having an affair with. And so that was really where the treason came in, that Catherine, by having the intention to have an affair, would have been putting the Tudor line in jeopardy by the potential that she could get pregnant. Or even just not prove whose it was. That there could always be a debate that it wasn't Henry's child. So it is, there were a lot of loopholes found in the process of Catherine's demise. Also Anne Boleyn's. She sort of gave some of the loopholes that brought Catherine down. But yeah, the intention, Culpeper, I can say stupidly now, he may have been tortured, so you say whatever you need. He did say that he had intended to sleep with the queen. That was enough. He had confessed that he had intended. But they also changed a lot at the time to be able to execute an insane person, because Lady Rochford, who was also, cousin by marriage, because she was married to Anne Boleyn's brother at the time when he was alive, but she had helped facilitate the relationship between Katherine Howard and Thomas Culpeper. And when she was arrested, she had a mental breakdown, and at the time it was illegal to execute an insane person, but Henry VIII changed the law so that you could.
Classic Henry VIII.
Yeah, classic. So she was also executed, and, she was, we aren't sure. She may have been faking it to try to get out of the death penalty, but that can never be proven. Probably had gone insane. Her husband and sister-in-law were executed. Now she's in the Tower with these kinds of, treason being held over her head. I probably would go crazy too.
Yeah.
I'd probably lose my mind.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Absolutely. So where do we go from here? In terms of looking at Katherine Howard, how should we try and shift her legacy, shift her perception, and change it to a kind of more nuanced, more balanced narrative, somewhere in between the two? Where do you think we should head? Yeah,
I do think that there should be sort of a better middle ground. There is an attempt to do that in only very recent years. Like you've mentioned, Gareth Russell's book, Young and Damned and Fair, does try to sort of portray her in an unbiased way. He does obviously talk about the affairs that she's had, because most of those are on record, but he also gives her way more complexity and gives her way more depth and backstory than she often gets. And so that there is an attempt. I think there is the potential to go too far then into complete victim, which is where we need to try to find the happy medium. But as is the case with most history and most legacies, it's really hard to change an established view on someone, especially an established view on someone who doesn't have that much records left behind.
Yeah.
That, what we have on Catherine is what we have, and most of it is written by others, not by her, unless something magically is found years later that resurfaces and uncovers this new sort of way of looking at Catherine's life. It's sort of like we have what we have, and most of it isn't that great, but so that makes it difficult as well, that you're not able to produce this new letter to be like, look everyone, this is what she was really like. We can't know that. And I think it's, it is a lot with women in history as well, that it turns very personal, that with Katherine, you know, if you would talk about it, you know, some people, their response would just be like, oh, I just don't like her. I just don't like her choices. And it's like, well, you didn't meet her. Like, we actually don't know what she was like as a human being.
Yeah.
We don't know if we would like her or not. We just have these things that are recorded about her. And so trying to change that from people is also very difficult, especially when, you know, the media portrays her one way, that, you know, maybe historians can have these debates, but it's hard to bring in the general public when the only access they have is the Tudors and the Six Wives of Henry VIII that really don't make her look that good. And so, you know, there is that struggle. And I think it is important for us to start to acknowledge sort of the reality that she was a real teenage girl. We have the benefit of hindsight to see that, you know, Culpeper they were going to be found out, but also, you know, that Henry lived only for like 3 or 4 years after she died. So in our hindsight perspective, it's like, oh, she would have made it. Like, if she had just held out, not done the thing with Culpeper, just played it safe. But feasibly, Henry could have lived for another 10, 15, 20 years. Would have been a little difficult to imagine, but he could have.
Yeah.
And so in Catherine's mind, like, this was her life for the foreseeable future.
Yeah.
With a man who was sliding farther and farther into being a tyrant and being very unpredictable in his moods, very ill, very demanding, very paranoid. And, you know, when you try to look at it in that moment, it's a little more understandable, where you might think, well, especially if she was innocent and hadn't had sex with Culpeper, there is a sense of like, yeah, why not? Like, why not have this friendship, a genuine friendship with someone who knew her before she was queen, who liked her before she was queen. And, you know, for all we know, they would just get together to chat about things. Like, it could have been as innocent as that. And it is understandable that she was making those choices, not knowing of the horrifying consequences that were waiting just around the corner. But she didn't know that. And, you know, I think for Katherine especially, the myth and sort of the legend of her has become so big that we lose the real person that she was. And that, you know, we need to start acknowledging both her faults, that she was an agent of her own fate. She did play a hand in it. She wasn't this puppet that everyone moved around the board and then abandoned her when they got caught. Like, she did make these choices. But at the same time, she shouldn't be fully condemned for them, especially today when women are largely not condemned for their sexual choices. And if Anne Boleyn is being celebrated for those choices, I think Katherine Howard should be, while not necessarily celebrated, maybe celebrated, but at least not condemned and labeled as a slut, pretty much, and sort of given the, you know, idea that she is more complex and she had more things going for her than just that, and she did more things than just that should be remembered and honored. And also sort of, I think we have a tendency with history to want to sort of make it okay in our mind when something really tragic happens. Like, there has to be a reason, there has to be a fault somewhere. And so I think it is really easy to look at Katherine Howard and be like, well, she sort of did it to herself. Not that most people are saying she deserved to die. I think everyone acknowledges that that's still very extreme.
Yeah.
But I think it's easier for us to not be fully disturbed by it if we convince ourselves that she sort of deserved what was coming to her because she made these decisions and she made these mistakes and they were stupid and she should have known better. She had the Anne Boleyn story to look to and know what could happen. You know, it is frustrating. I'm like, why did you do that? But at the same time, there isn't always a reason for why something horrible happens. And I do think also in public perception, Henry VIII tends to get off a little too easily on these things.
Sure.
Also, that he was the psychopath in this who married a teenage girl in his 40s, but also was so brutal to the woman that people at the time said that was his true love. He caressed more than the others, and my God, how quickly his passion went to hatred is also disturbing. And, you know, that once she proved to not be his quote-unquote rose without a thorn, how quickly he abandoned her and wanted to destroy her and make sure that nothing of her remained. So, you know, remembering that as well, that she was as much a victim as the agent of what happened to her in the end.
I think that's a fascinating and very well said conclusion to the Katherine Howard issue. But it's interesting as well with those portrayals. It kind of seems like every portrayal we get is almost a vindication of Henry VIII.
Yeah.
That either she was the one that was sleeping around and Henry gets off scot-free, or she was this victim of people that was potentially other than Henry VIII. And obviously he was awful, he was horrible, but for some reason he gets out of it, whereas the other ones don't. And it's just an interesting kind of thing that everything seems to work together to vindicate Henry.
Yeah, it's a weird thing in Tudor popular perception that, you know, even I go to Hampton Court on a regular basis. I love Hampton Court, but there is like sometimes Henry is made almost into this like big goof.
Right.
Like he's silly almost, and not acknowledging how much really of a psychopath he was. That, you know, he, especially in his later years, that he did become very paranoid, and he did become woke up one day feeling something and woke up the next feeling something completely different. And it is sort of a weird thing that we make him into this like epitome of Englishness, and English history is like Henry VIII. And it's, well, yeah, and it is a really defining feature. It's also like, let's not glorify him too much. Like he is a little over glorified at times and over vindicated that it's, you know, all the other people around him were manipulating these things. You know, Thomas Cromwell was in charge of Anne Boleyn's downfall. It was his fault. He manipulated it. You know, Norfolk manipulated Catherine into her position and then abandoned her when it came out that these were parts of her past. You know, like it's always, while Henry is usually in the game, it's someone else way more powerful. I mean, even Wolsey in his early years, it was all him. Like he was the one doing all of these things. And it's like, very rarely is it's like, well, no, Henry had to sign these death warrants. Like Henry, I mean, especially for the Anne Boleyn, like Thomas Cromwell most likely got a go-ahead from Henry on these things. Like, I don't think he would have had the audacity to go behind his back and try to blacken Anne Boleyn's name without some indication from Henry that he wanted this to happen. Yeah. Which is exactly why when Catherine had her downfall, no one went and told him in person. Like, there is this sense of, like, you need Henry's approval before you blacken his wives' names. Yeah. But if he's all for it, you've got to go ahead. You can do anything. Yeah. You can bring out any sort of thing from left field to try to demolish these women. But he has to be on board. Yeah. Like, you can't surprise him, or else all hell could break loose, which it did in the beginning with Catherine, until it was proven that it was true. But it's a weird, like happy-go-lucky Henry thing in most fictional portrayals. I mean, I think Philippa Gregory refers to him as a psychopath sometimes, but there's its own issues with her portrayal of the Tudors. So that's its own podcast. Yeah. Especially her portrayal of Katherine Howard. My God, it's pretty rough. But you know, it is true. It's interesting. Yeah.
Maybe that's another episode for another day of the Tudors in general. Absolutely. No, that's brilliant. Well, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. It was great to have you here, and a fascinating conversation about Katherine Howard. And as always, make sure to use this episode as a stepping stone to continue research into the fascinating history of this country. This is not the ultimate final word on the issue. It is
by far.
Yeah, it is very much a doorway through which to walk. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. Make sure to follow us on all social medias to keep up to date with everything we do. And we'll see you next time on the Present History Podcast.